Um, Last week we were covering this example, and we're going to be doing essentially looking at different ways that you can lay out your code via CSS for the next little while anyhow. And last time we went over this example. I believe I mentioned this. This is called Greek text. It's just sort of filler text. While you're designing your page, you might not have the final text that you want to put there. You can go and you can get Greek text, which is sort of a fake Latin Greek text. I'm not sure if it says anything or not. That is acceptable within a prototype, but it's never acceptable in a finished product. So any of your assignments or your project, do not turn in a final product with Greek text. The only place that is allowable is if you are developing your prototype for the project. I think we went through most of the CSS here. I think we had a few items to wrap up. So let me open up the CSS file. I know we covered this. I know we covered this. Border radius, by the way, makes how curved it is. H1, I believe we covered this. I believe we covered this. These I don't believe we covered. All right, so we have a few more things to go. First of all, Nav Ul. Nav Ul means any UL within the nav section gets the style rule. Remember, the first part of the style rule, what you see here is called the selector. It's called the selector because it selects what gets the particular style rule. So over here, we said H1. Because we just said H1, that means every H1 on our page, unless it's overridden. Here we said Nav Ul, which means only the ULs in the nav section. And therefore, this UL gets the style, whereas if we had any other ULs on the page, it would not get the style. And what is the style? First of all, we said list style type none. All right, what does that mean? That simply means that there is no dot in front of it when we look at the page. Notice how most unordered lists that you had, there was a dot or a period, not a period, a dot before the list entries. Here there is none because we said list style type none. You can review, there's other things that you can have besides a dot, by the way. All right, Nav Li means all the LIs in the nav section. All right. And we said display inline margin 4 left. What that's going to do is it's going to put 4 spaces between it and the next item, and it makes it inline. What does inline mean? It means right next to each other. There's two kinds of, there's a couple of kinds, several kinds of display values that you can have. One of them is block. All right. Blocks are just like all of these are block elements. They stack on top of each other like blocks. All right. And that's the default for many of the tags that we've covered so far. All right. The nav, the section, the footer, the header, paragraph, and so on. All of those have a display type of block. And that's the default. LIs have its display type as block as well. Remember, if we did not have the style code in, these would be stacked up on top of each other. All right. We said inline, which means they're lined up right next to each other with 4 spaces in between them. We made the link look a certain way. I don't think we talked about that, but is pretty much what we have covered before. And we've given a nav a colon hover. Colon hover is a pseudo class, it's called. It relates to certain conditions that a link could be in. In this case, hover means when you put your mouse on the link, what happens? And all I've done simply is invert the colors. That way you can see what you're mousing over. And you can tell that that's a link. All right, that doesn't happen when I put my mouse here or here. So that gives you a visual cue that that's a link that you're talking about. So you can do mouse over effects with the hover pseudo class. We have something that is called important, which is a class. How do I know it's a class? Because it begins with a period. Period important means there's something on the page that has a class of important. And in this case, it is this paragraph right here. And it gets the style rule, and it is in red, and it is in, and it is, I believe it is bold as well. Yep. Notice that I called it important instead of red bold. Why is it better to call it important than red bold? Any ideas? Well, you might change how you want to display important things. Right now, we decided to make them red and bold. Later on, we might make them have a white background and black font and a bigger font instead of a smaller font. And we can do that just by changing this style rule. So I could go and cut this out and say background white, what I say, make it bigger, font size 1.5 EM, colon color black. We might decide we want to show important things that way. And if we do that, then we save it. It makes the important thing look like that. Now, it would be very hard to understand if the style class was called red text. You'd be looking at the page and saying there is no red text. That style rule must not come into play. But if you give it the style class the name of important, then it's clear that this is the reason why you're using this style. You're using this style for extra important information. All right. And it won't just do it to this page. Any page that has something that was important will get that style rule. It's also good to use two ways of communicating the fact that a certain text is important. The reason for that is some people might be colorblind, for example. So if the only difference I had was the color of the text being red, a colorblind person won't be able to see it. But if I make it red in a different font or red and bold, then even a person that is colorblind can see the difference between the two things. All right. I think there was one more thing. Oh, credits. I have something called credits, and they're over here. It's kind of the fine print of the website. Where I say where I got the background image from. People ask me sometimes, where do I cite the place that I got the different materials from? Put it in the footer, it would be generally my rule of thumb. Put it in the folder, and you can make it smaller if you want, you know. That way you're still complying with the law without really screwing up the design of your page. Now remember the process that we talked about. I would make a template that would have all the common things that's going to appear on every page. So it would have the HTML tag, the body tag, this nav tag, this header tag, this footer tag, and the ending tags. The middle section is what's going to be different from page to page. So I would make that template once, get it look the way that I want to, and then start cloning it to be the different pages. So all you have to do is change the section in the middle, and that will be another page. And the rest of the page is going to look very consistent. And that's a very solid design principle, that your pages should have a consistent look and feel. All right? That doesn't mean every page needs to be structured exactly identical. There may be certain pages that are a little bit different. They might have a submenu to them, or might be laid out slightly different. But in general, you want your pages, especially on a smaller site, to convey sort of a consistent look and feel. Any questions about this one? All right, let's go on to the next version of the design. Now, keep in mind, as we look at these other versions, that the HTML, near as I know, are identical on all these pages. So if we were to look at index.html, it looks exactly like it looked before. But what is different is the CSS that was applied to it. So if we look at the index now, that is the exact same page. Did I make any changes? No, I didn't. That's odd. Let's look at prototype 1 then. Huh. Oh, I know what I changed. On the surface, this looks about the same, except the text is a little wider on it. But what I did is I used percentages for the widths of things. That sort of accommodates people with different size screens. And it also begins to accommodate people that are viewing this on a mobile browser, on a mobile device. If you had a small browser window, it would look like this. If I didn't take into account that, the screen size, on a very big window, it would be like a very small sticker on the web page, and it would be wasting a lot of space on the page. So what you can do is you can use percentages instead of absolute numbers. Now, we're going to get more into this later, but using percentages is one of the things that you want to do when you do websites for mobile devices. So how do I know without actually hooking up my phone and bringing up the page that way? Google Chrome has a built-in ability to say what it would look like on a iPhone SE, what it will look like on a Samsung Galaxy, what about an iPad, and so on. So you can sort of preview it, what it's going to look like on mobile devices without actually having those mobile devices. And in this case, the page didn't look bad. All right. The text was small, but that's because the window was small compared to the actual size of what it would be in real life. All right. There's more things that we can do than this, but that's a good start, is to make things have not absolute sizes, but make them have percentages. So really all we did in this example is we changed the width to be 75%. Whenever we do that, it means 75% of the available space. All right. In this case, the header is part of the body. So if I say 75%, it takes up 75% of the whole screen. If I put something inside of here and made it a different percentage, then it would be, if I put a percentage on this paragraph, it would be whatever the percentage of this particular paragraph would be. Let me do that to show you. So if I say paragraph with 50%, make sure, do I have another paragraph style in here? I don't. All right. It didn't make it 50% of the whole screen. As you can see, this is 50% of the 75%. So it's a percentage of whatever contains that element. Nice thing that browsers do is wrap the text to make it fit. In other words, as it's resizing this, it automatically adjusts how much text is in there. Now, one thing I have too, which is useful if you're using percentages, is a minimum and a maximum width. All right. You can specify a minimum width of how big it shouldn't get any bigger than, and you can specify a minimum width as well. If I get rid of the minimum width, as I start making this narrower, it gets narrower and narrower, and it could get to the point of not being legible. Let me put that on the nav instead. So if I get rid of the minimum width on the nav section, at a certain point, things start to scrunch up in a way that isn't good. So I have a minimum width to keep things from getting too small so that they can scrunch up. The other thing is I could keep things from getting too big if I wanted to with a maximum width. So I could say maybe max width, make it 750 pixels. Because even if you have a gigantic screen, it's very difficult reading a line that goes all the way across the screen if you have a very large screen. So in this case, notice that the navigation stops growing at some point, and it stops shrinking at a point because it has a minimum and a maximum width. I found that using a minimum width especially is useful when you have relative sizes. Is everyone clear on when I use the word absolute versus relative? Absolute means that there's a hard-coded number there. That's how the first one was, 600 pixels. That means 600 pixels on this, 600 pixels on an iPhone, 600 pixels on any device that views it. If I say percentage, though, that's relative because that is 75% of the screen the person is using relative to the size of the screen. I think that's about all that's in this example. Yep. Everything else about it is the same. This is a slightly better design. As a rule, it's better to use percentages than absolute numbers. Sometimes you will use absolute numbers if you have a very intricate design that you want to look exactly perfect on every device. But that's kind of rare. It's much more common to use percentages to get the size of something. So that's our second prototype. Notice we didn't touch the HTML at all. All the changes that I made were in the CSS. Now, that's why I often say, don't do things like putting your style on the body tag inside the HTML. The better that you can separate the content from the styling, the better shape that you are, because it allows you for much more flexibility and the ability to change in one place and have it changed everywhere. What I'm referring to is what are called inline styles. You can do something like this. And I would suggest that it's very rarely a good idea to do that. All right? Because if I did that and I wanted all my H1s to look the same, I would have to literally change every H1 on my entire site if I changed my design and wanted it to look a little different. All right? Now you might say, what if I only wanted a few of them to look different? Well, that's when you use the class selector or the ID selector in your CSS file. By doing, and separating the style from the content also means don't add things like an HR tag. What does the HR tag do? It's a horizontal rule. In other words, an underline between here and here. What is wrong with that? Well, you're stuck with that underline, all right? It'd be much better to play with the borders of these paragraphs. You could do the same thing. So let me get rid of this, HRs, and let me put in here a style tag. They had a style rule for paragraphs, and I can define border bottom one pixel black solid. So it's virtually the same thing. Not sure why the margin's not working. I don't want to waste too much time figuring it out, but you get the idea. Through CSS, I can get virtually the same look. If I played around with it a little bit more, I would have gotten the two to look identical. So it's better to do anything that relates to the appearance in CSS because it's easier to change, and it's easier to change throughout your entire site as opposed to having to put things in on every single page. All right. Let's look at prototype number 3. HTML is the same. Style sheet. All right. Let's look how this looks. All right. This looks a little different. All right. But there is no change in the HTML. Again, this is our own little CSS Zen Garden. Did I talk to you about CSS Zen Garden in this class? CSS Zen Garden is a page where you can see the web page displayed a bunch of different ways. So this is the default version of the page. And if you read some of the headers, CSS Zen Garden, a demonstration of what can be accomplished, the road to enlightenment. And if we go to a different view, this is the exact same HTML, but with different CSS applied. This site was created back when people were not using CSS very much, when people were putting their appearance things in the HTML. So a group of these web designers wanted to show off to the world what you can do with CSS. There's another style. And you actually can, as a designer, submit your design. And they take some of these designs and put them as featured on their website. The point is, the sky's the limit as far as what you can change on a web page and make it, you know, have it have the same content but look wildly different. All right. We'll look at this in a second. Notice how it's the same from page to page, but we go to Iceland, this changes. We'll see how we did that in a second here. All right. In this case, we use what's called absolute positioning. And again, getting back to the word absolute, that means that we're going to give some hard-coded numbers of where we're going to put things. Remember, we talked about the box model, how this header section is like a giant rectangle that we can specify the width of, the height of, and also the position of. And in this case, we put it absolutely 10 from the top, 10 from the left. So that's where this appears. 10 from the top, 10 from the left. I can get rid of the curving of the header to make it more obvious the position of this. Ten from the top, 10 from the left. And that in a nutshell is how you do absolute positioning. You space out and you decide where things are going to lay out. You make sure that they don't overlap. Absolute positioning works best when you use also absolute sizing. So I said, okay, make it a width of 800. Make this a width of 200, and so on. Notice that this page is nailed down. It doesn't adjust to the width of the screen, and that's a drawback to this approach. But if I had an intricate design that I wanted to work, and I wanted to be sure it worked a certain way, you could use this technique. Now, if I went to view this on a mobile device, actually doesn't look bad on an iPad Air. It doesn't look terrible on any of these. Of course, if we were viewing on an actual phone, we'd see how big the font was, and that probably would be hard to read on the smaller devices. We do that to all the main elements of the screen. We don't have to do that to the header. All right. I'm sorry, the H1. We do that to the header. We do that to the nav. We do it to the section, and we do it for the footer. Everything else sort of falls in place when you position those main sections. Resist the urge to sort of micromanage your CSS. In other words, putting in a style rule for every single thing. All right. I don't have to say where that paragraph appears. There's no style rule for any of the paragraphs because they're included inside the section, and therefore they're going to fall in place inside that section. So without putting any sort of CSS on it, they do what I want them to do. That, I believe, is the only difference between these two pages. I set the top and the left and use position absolute. Now again, notice that the HTML for this page and this page is the same. Yet they look wildly different because we didn't put anything in the HTML relating to the appearance. We put everything that relates to appearance in the CSS file. And it will work not just for one page, but will work with every page. Now, how did we handle Iceland? All right. Because Iceland, if you notice, has a different background image. All right. We did it this way. We created a second style sheet called Iceland CSS. And all it has is that the header has a background URL of Iceland.jpg. Now let's look at the HTML of the Iceland page. The Iceland page actually has two CSS files to it. It has the style page, which every page gets, and then it has the special Iceland CSS. And the way that they are sequenced is the Iceland CSS is after the main CSS. That means that it's going to overrule anything in the main CSS. If it doesn't overrule it, we'll get what's in the main CSS. But if it does overrule it, in this case, we're not going to get this as a background image. We're going to get this as the background image. So you don't have to redo the whole style sheet for Iceland.css. You just code what's different between the two. Because you can have multiple style sheets associated with a page. And the last one, or the one after, is going to overrule the ones before. All right? This is a very important technique that we'll definitely get into when we get into mobile devices a little bit more. All right? Because with mobile devices, you may want a totally different style for a desktop version of the page versus a mobile version of the page to sort of optimize it for the mobile environment. All right. I think that is it for this prototype. Any questions? Prototype 4. Sort of looks the same, but it was accomplished a totally different way. Notice also there's a scroll bar attached to this so that you can scroll through to see the content. That's nice because you can keep everything sort of on the same page and the user doesn't have to scroll. If the user does scroll, they can scroll just that text area. Let's look at the CSS here. Again, the HTML is the same, so I won't bring it up unless we need to look at something. Let's look at the style sheet itself. All right, what is going on here? Notice I didn't put any position on the header. And I didn't put any position on the nav. All right. Why don't I do that? I don't do that because these two things are lining up like they would if I had no style sheet at all. So for example, if I were to get rid of the whole style sheet, let's get rid of this part of the style sheet. And view this web page. The header and the nav roughly appear where I want them to. Now we have to juggle the position a little bit. We want to put some margins on here and we want to put borders and all that. But basically, without any CSS, those two things are where we want them to be. Therefore, we do not have to put any styling in to make them appear where we want them to be. However, where does the section start? It starts down here. We want the section to be up here. Okay? We want the section to be up here. In other words, we want to move it from the left a certain number of pixels and move it up a certain number of pixels. For that, we use relative layout. So if you notice on the section, we say position relative, left 250 pixels. So that pushes things over 250 pixels from the left. And it says top negative 380. That pulls it up 380 pixels from the bottom. So we push it over 250, push it up 380. So remember, it was supposed to appear down here. So we pushed, in fact, let me get rid of that relative positioning. We put it down here. We want to move it and move it. That's what the relative positioning does. This takes advantage of the fact that our browsers are pretty smart. They know how to position things. We just have to help them out a little bit sometimes and say, take where you're going to put this and put it in a different place instead. That's exactly what relative positioning is. We made sure this didn't go all the way over by setting the width of it. And we cut down the width of this so it will fit nicely over in this position. We added an overflow of auto. And what that does is if there's too much content for the space that we gave, it will create a scroll bar. If there's too much going wide, like we had a wide image in there, it would also create a horizontal scroll bar. But it does that automatically. The rest of the CSS remains the same. We did the same thing for the footer, by the way. We altered only the top, though, because we need to push the footer up. Because without that, the footer is going to appear way down here. So we want to push it up 350. And that's what we did. All right. I know this is a lot of material. I will make these examples available for you to review. All right, so you can take the time and dissect them. This is also a good thing for you to play with. In other words, take these pages and try adjusting the positions and the numbers and all that. Prototype 5. Again, looks similar, but notice something cool. The navigation doesn't move. Isn't that a great feature to put the navigation such that the user sees it no matter where they scroll to on the page? So how do I accomplish that? Notice that all the other elements in the page just have a basic CSS to them, except they have a margin left that pushes it over 300 pixels from the left. So all the main sections of the page, except the navigation, have a margin left of 300. That's pushing it 300 from the edge of the page. Have that on the header, have that on our section, have that on our footer. All right. What about the nav, though? The nav, we specify a top of 10, a left of 10, and a position fixed. Position fixed is like absolute, except it doesn't move when you scroll the page. And that's especially useful for maybe headers or headings. And it's also good for navigation. We could, for example, put this header to have a position fixed too, and that might not be a bad idea. Well, we'd have to do a margin for the section. It goes on top of it. Weird. Okay, rewind and don't pay attention to anything I said about that. But I'm not sure what I'm not hitting on, but this is most useful to set the navigation. You could also set the header, but I'm not doing that very successfully right now. I screwed something up with this. Let me pull it from the zip file again. All right, that's what we want. Let me look at the CSS to see if there's something I changed that. All right, well, it's back the way it should be. So that's how it is out on the, it will be out on Canvas. The last thing we're going to cover today, we will not cover today. I just looked at the clock. We will cover that on next week. All right. Keep in mind, from now on, all the assignments you do, try these things out. You know, don't just stick with one design. All right. In fact, for some of the upcoming homework assignments, I don't remember which ones, but for some of them, you're asked to do 2 versions of the same page. Use different style sheets and don't just change the color from blue to a slightly lighter shade of blue, all right, where it virtually looks the same. Change it so that on one version of it, it has one kind of layout. On another version, it has a different kind of layout. Any questions? All right, we'll see you over in lab.